Only in America.
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 This time, in our journey between a wall and a hard place, we're looking at what migrants face when they arrive at the U.S. Mexico border.
It is so crowded that when I was there, I heard that judges are having to stay until 9 p.m. working unpaid overtime to hear all the cases that day. On the day I was able to attend court in El Paso, 86 people were in one judge's docket, and it was chaos. The judge had to do everything in a mass hearing. People were confused. I witnessed one person stand up and ask the judge and say, "Judge, all of the forms you're giving us are in English. Do you have a copy of any of these in Spanish? Because otherwise I can't read this form." And the judge responded and said, "I'm sorry, it's the rules. I can't give you anything else."
Specifically, the new policies at the border that are creating chaos and disorder, not safety and security.
What we see is a policy that may inhibit the process for individuals to make their full claim for protection and may disallow them of receiving proper legal services and presenting their case to the court. And as a result, at the end of the day, most individuals are rejected from their asylum request.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani, and this is Only in America. We've heard about the dangers migrants face along the journeys they take after fleeing their homes. We've heard about borderland shelters and the people working to support migrants. This time, we hear about the chaos migrants have to untangle upon arriving. The United States has long prided itself on welcoming people who are fleeing desperate situations. But do our border policies reflect this sentiment? We talked briefly in our last episode about a policy called Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as MPP or Remain in Mexico. The Trump administration implemented MPP exactly 1 year ago today. The policy forces asylum seekers to wait in Mexico for their court hearings. Previously, asylum seekers were allowed to wait inside the United States. This means that migrants are waiting in dangerous border towns and attempting to navigate a complex U.S. asylum process from Mexico, often without legal assistance or representation. Last year in Ciudad Juarez, I had a chance to speak with migrants remaining in Mexico till their court cases were heard. What I heard from migrants and the lawyers trying to help them makes it clear that the Migrant Protection Protocols are neither protecting anyone nor helping anyone. Today, we'll dive into how this policy has been affecting people arriving at the border over the past year, and later, what a more effective system could look like.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
The Migrant Protection Protocols are directly affecting the people arriving at the border, as well as the lawyers and judges working on their cases. I spoke to Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, policy counsel at the American Immigration Council, about how he's witnessed firsthand the negative impact of this policy. Aaron told me about how the policy is harming people who are trying to seek safety and the immediate risks that they face. So Aaron, thank you very, very much for joining today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Ali.
So give me a sense of the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP. Where did they come from? What are they doing? And then what do you think that MPP means for the future of border enforcement?
I like to describe the Migrant Protection Protocols, or MPP, as a humanitarian catastrophe and a problem in search of a problem. Because what MPP is an effective denial of the right of asylum seekers to access the asylum process. And when the administration first announced MPP in December 2018, it came a few months after family separation ended at the extreme outcry of the American people. Border numbers were going up, not massively so, but more than the administration wanted, and this was about the time that Donald Trump shut down the government to declare a crisis and demand more money for his border wall. So as that was going on during the government shutdown, the administration put together MPP, and it said it needed it to stop people from disappearing into the United States, which is not actually a thing that the vast majority of asylum seekers do. And the administration also said that it needed MPP to promote an effective and efficient immigration process at the border, by which they meant railroad people through a process where they have no access to attorneys and hope that they all get ordered deported before being able to enter the United States. It is really hard not to talk about the cynicism by which the administration rolled out this policy. From its very name, the so-called Migrant Protection Protocols, the administration painted this as something to help those people at the border. But when you go down to the border, when you talk to people in the program, when you see the fear in their eyes, there is no protection involved here. What this is at its heart, a policy to keep people from stepping over the U.S. border, and if they do step over the U.S. border, to prevent them and to immediately send them back to Mexico and stop them from going any further.
So describe to me what you're seeing when you go to McAllen or El Paso. What are you seeing as MPP has been implemented?
So I've only actually been to Ciudad Juarez and seen how MPP works on the ground myself in El Paso. But the common theme across the border is chaos and fear. Many people are being asked to wait months or years in some of the most dangerous places in Mexico, places where the U.S. State Department tells Americans that they should not travel, and places where the cartels, by and large, control access to the ports of entry and enact a heavy toll on anyone passing through the region, especially vulnerable Central American asylum seekers. Across the border, people are being asked to show up at a port of entry at 3:30 a.m. Many of them have been living in shelters. Some of them have been living in tents in squalid refugee camps in Matamoros. Many of them have no idea what the process is, because the big difference between being in Mexico and being in the United States, other than the danger, is access to a lawyer. Within the United States, by the time people get to the stage of filing an asylum application, about 50% of people actually have a lawyer. As a result, what that means is that people have an opportunity to know what the system is. But when it comes to MPP, if you're living in a tent camp in Matamoros, how are you supposed to find a lawyer? So people go into the system with no idea what they're doing.
Could you describe kind of what that looks like when somebody is able to enter the U.S. for that first court appointment?
So in El Paso, I'll start there in El Paso and then Matamoros. In El Paso, MPP has broken the immigration courts. The El Paso Immigration Court, which hears MPP cases, has 4 judges. Through the end of December, more than 17,000 MPP cases have been filed in El Paso. 2 judges retired early, and their dockets are now being heard by video from judges from other courts around the country. It is so crowded that when I was there, I heard that judges are having to stay until 9 p.m. working unpaid overtime to hear all the cases that day. And it was chaos. The judge had to do everything in a mass hearing. People were confused. I witnessed one person stand up and ask the judge and say, "Judge, all of the forms you're giving us are in English. Do you have a copy of any of these in Spanish? Because otherwise I can't read this form." And the judge responded and said, "I'm sorry, it's the rules. I can't give you anything else." Now, in El Paso, at least, they get to see the judge. They get to be in a physical courtroom. When an asylum seeker is in Matamoros and they have to go to the Brownsville court, they actually are going to a tent facility set up in shipping containers that has been built next to the port of entry. They shuffle into a room inside this essentially container facility, and they see a judge on the other side of a video screen, where the judge may be one place, the government attorney may be another place, their lawyer may be with them, their lawyer may be in a third place, and they don't necessarily even see the translator as well. So they're getting translation through a bad quality phone line, and the judge may be so tiny on the screen that they can't even make out any details. And this is the system that the government's setting up and touting as a major success.
So as you've taken a step back, like you're saying earlier, looking at kind of these big policy questions, what are the implications in terms of long-term border enforcement policy?
It's hard to say whether the administration views MPP as a permanent measure or as a stopgap, a deterrent to just get people to stop coming. But in the long term, MPP and some of the other programs that the administration are running out at the border are an effort to end asylum at the southern border entirely. We've now seen that with the choice to send Mexicans to Guatemala and now Honduras under the so-called Safe Third Country agreements. And we've also seen this in programs that are meant to speed up the asylum process at the border for those who can't be sent to Mexico under MPP, with the goal that the administration sets up so many hurdles that no one will be able to pass them. And along that, Stephen Miller probably phrased it best in an email that I believe was obtained by NBC. He said his goal was to implement multiple unsolvable dilemmas across the border. And in many ways, MPP is one of those unsolvable dilemmas.
So think ahead. Let's just say, we're having this conversation next year at this time with a new administration coming in place, or the other scenario is we're having this conversation in 5 years with a new administration coming in place. What does kind of reconstituting border enforcement, much less immigration policy, look like, given the way that MPP and other programs, like you said, have broken the court system?
Untangling the mess of 2018, 2019, and 2020 is going to take years. One positive side about all of this is that the administration has not gone through the normal process to create these programs. MPP is a policy. It is actually not written down in stone in anything other than a memorandum from then Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, DHS Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. So the next administration, with the stroke of a pen on day one, could end MPP. Things like the asylum cooperative agreements with Guatemala and Honduras are going to be a little bit harder to roll back, but the administration could, again, a new administration could on day one just choose to not utilize those agreements without having to formally revoke them. So many of the actual policies could be overturned quite quickly. The issue is going to be ensuring that that actually happens and ensuring that any future administrations don't turn around and say, well, these policies actually did stop people from coming. Because, of course, in some ways, punitive deterrence, inflicting punishment on people when they get to the border does deter people. It's immoral, it violates the law, and as a long-term policy, it's ineffective. But as a short-term measure to stop people from coming, punishing them, inflicting pain, unfortunately, as horrifying it is to say that, the administration has effectively inflicted enough pain on people at the border, families and children, and hurt enough people that fewer people are coming for now. So the question is going to be for a new administration in the future, are they willing to risk the possibility that families start coming again and start continuing to recognize that America is a country that accepts the vulnerable? And will a new administration agree that it cannot inflict the same kinds of pain on families and children?
Yeah, so that's the nut of this, right? We will get through this phase, whether it's another year or more, but on the other side of it, how do we put some guardrails up so that we can restore an asylum system that treats people compassionately and people can get their day in court in a fair and just way?
There's some solutions that at this point everyone's agreed upon. One of them is the creation of an independent immigration court system, an immigration court system that's not headquartered in the Department of Justice and that can't be used as a political weapon. Everyone agrees that courts should be neutral, but unfortunately, the Trump administration has weaponized the immigration courts and made them parts of things like MPP, where when you talk to immigration judges who are involved with it, often they express horror at what they're being asked to do and at their involvement in these cases. But nevertheless, they go forward with it because they've been ordered to do it. Similarly, we need to install some form of guardrails to prevent the administration from doing things like this in the future, whether that be changing the law or passing new regulations or simply winning court battles. No administration should be able to weaponize the asylum system and effectively revoke the possibility of anyone winning asylum if they do what is 100% legal, come to the southern border and ask for asylum.
And what do you think that the next year looks like for those children and families, whether they're waiting in Juarez or Matamoros? Is there any chance of them getting their day in court?
The Ninth Circuit heard a case challenging MPP on October 1st, and we are currently waiting for a decision in that case. If the Ninth Circuit finds, as I hope they do, that the MPP is illegal and does not comport with international or domestic law, then they could put the program on halt, though it's likely that the Trump administration would go straight to the Supreme Court. If they put it on halt, it remains really unclear what's going to happen to families who are on the other side of the border. We hope that they will be allowed to re-enter and go through the asylum process inside the United States. But presuming that MPP is allowed to continue, what we unfortunately will likely see is thousands of families, many of them who have very strong asylum cases, being denied asylum and being denied an opportunity to seek refuge in the U.S.
You mentioned the court cases. Where do the MPP cases stand these days?
Yeah, so the MPP case, the people who sued against MPP won at the initial level. The district court judge said MPP is illegal and that the administration needs to provide more protection for people in the program. One of the things that the judge highlighted, and which came up really importantly during oral arguments at the Ninth Circuit, is that the government does not ask people if they're afraid to go back to Mexico. It requires people to, quote, affirmatively, unquote, express a fear of going to Mexico before they get any form of screening. And we know from a lot of evidence from internal whistleblowers within USCIS and from the people's experiences who've gone through the interviews, even if they do get an interview, that interview is mostly a sham. Almost no one passes the interview, and people report situations where they had previously been kidnapped and grievously assaulted in Mexico and were nevertheless sent back a second time. So the Ninth Circuit expressed a lot of concern about that process and said, look, you have to at the very least ask people, but right now we're waiting for a decision, so we don't know when that will come. Best case scenario, 2020 is a situation where all of these policies get blocked in court, and in 2021, a new administration overturns them and restores order. Worst case scenario, courts or the Supreme Court keep these policies in place until 2020, and it's up to the next administration in 2020 or after that to untangle the mess that has been the result of all of these programs.
Well, I got to say, again, thank you very, very much for everything that the American Immigration Council and your partners are doing. It's incredible work. My last question for you, just to finish this sentence, only in America, ...
Oh, that's a tricky one.
That's a hard pivot, too.
I know. Only in America, because, here I work with people who are from all countries around the world, and I like to think that all the people I work with, they bring different things to America, and yet what is the uniquely Americanness about this? I will say only in America will we have an administration claiming that it's protecting people at the border by throwing them to the wolves. But, that's a dark one. If we want a light one, I will say only in America would you see the kind of outpouring of support to hold up those very basic fundamental American principles of protecting the vulnerable and opening our arms, providing refuge to those seeking protection.
Hey, Aaron, for all the amazing work that you and everybody at the council are doing, you can have as many only in America as you'd like. So with the disorderly border situation we just learned about, it's pretty clear that something needs to change. To learn more about what border policy should look like, I spoke to foreign policy expert Christian Penichet-Paul. Christian focuses on border security, and he talked with me about what a more effective system could look like and the solutions our government should pursue. So, as you know, this week is the 1-year anniversary of the Migrant Protection Protocols. From your perspective, what should the United States be doing differently when it comes to border policies in light of this 1-year anniversary?
I think that is a very important question, Ali. As you mentioned, it's the 1-year anniversary of the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. And what I like to highlight whenever I talk about this issue at the beginning is that under U.S. law, it is acceptable for asylum seekers who arrive at the U.S. Mexico border or any border in the U.S. to request protection from persecution, regardless of who they are or how they came to the U.S. or how they entered America. And when we look at the Remain in Mexico policy, what we see is a policy that may inhibit the process for individuals to make their full claim for protection and may disallow them of receiving proper legal services and presenting their case to the court. And as a result, at the end of the day, most individuals are rejected from their asylum request. And there were some reports recently that about 11 out of 10,000 asylum cases under Remain in Mexico that have been processed and completed, only those 11 have been granted asylum.
So only 11 out of 10,000 cases, and that's 10,000 cases that have been heard?
Mm-hmm. Heard and completed and gone through the whole court process. And to put that in perspective, so those are 10,000 cases where the asylum seekers came to the U.S., presented themselves, which is, as I mentioned, is allowed under U.S. law. And then they were given a court date several months in advance, maybe 3 or 4 months, and then returned to Mexico to a northern Mexican border town where they had to find work or find housing for those several months and then go back to the border, present themselves for their appointment, go before the judge, and in most cases be sent back again because the first hearing is usually just to understand the process and then come back a couple months later. So they completed the process, and out of those 10,000 individuals, so far only 11. So that's 0.1%.
So what does a more effective system look like?
I think what we need to do is remember that our system has been in place for 50, 60 years. And the way we handle asylum seekers who present themselves is to provide them with safe haven in the U.S. while their court case moves forward. And if they're not granted asylum, which many of them may not receive at the end of the process, they are removed from the U.S. And that's the system we have under U.S. laws. And I think we can continue to pursue that and provide and meet our legal obligations while at the same time ensuring that the U.S. Mexico border remains protected and secure. And so the question is, how do we process asylum seekers who arrive at the U.S. border in a better way? And what we need to do is ensure that we're spending the right amount of resources in the right policies. So every year, the U.S. government spends about $4.5 billion on border security. And the question is, where is that money going to? And is that money going to the right solutions? What we have found is that we need to ensure that we are providing investments on our ports of entry, which are the areas that could potentially handle asylum seekers who show up at our borders. If we can supplement personnel and resources at ports of entry, they will be better able to handle and process asylum cases. We also need to ensure that we hire child welfare experts, that we hire translators and medical professionals, so that those very specific and very tough jobs do not fall on our Border Patrol agents. At the moment, we've heard many stories of Border Patrol agents who have to act as nannies, as some might say, because they have to take care of younger children who've come either by themselves or with their families while they're in Border Patrol custody. And if we can hire these professionals, child welfare experts, translators, medical professionals, they can do these jobs and leave the enforcement security aspect to our Border Patrol agents as it should be. And we also need to update our infrastructure at the border. Most of our detention holding facilities used by CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, the head agency of the Border Patrol, are outdated. They were built in the 1990s and the early 2000s when the majority of migrants coming to the U.S. were young workers coming to seek work and potentially a better life. That demographic has changed. Now we have mostly families and unaccompanied children fleeing persecution, mostly from the Central American countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We need to update those detention holding facilities that are temporary, but at the moment, because they're so old and not meant for families and children, end up resulting in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions.
And where do immigration judges fit into this?
I think it's very important that we hire and train enough immigration judges to where we can more quickly process the backlog of cases that we have in the system. And at the moment, there's about 1 million cases that are waiting to be heard. And 1 million is a very high number, and there are multiple reasons why we've reached that point. And I think some of those reasons go back to some of the administration's decisions to reopen cases that have been previously closed by immigration judges. But the fact of the matter is, we have a significant backlog and about 400 immigration judges working currently. We need to hire more immigration judges who can ensure that they know the asylum process very well and provide a definitive answer to cases. And that would allow us to take some of the burden of just those 400 judges who are currently working.
So then, a lot of what the administration has done, and even, the previous administration did this as well, is they had a belief that deterrence would be a policy that keeps the country more secure. Mm-hmm. But in what ways have you seen that deterrence-only policies have only just created more disorder?
Yeah, I think that is a very important question. As you mentioned, the administration has suggested that deterrence helps slow down migration. I think the data paints a more complicated picture. There are multiple factors that go into the decisions of individuals, of families and children fleeing their countries and coming into the U.S. Some of those are push factors, and whatever may be happening at the U.S. Mexico border and whatever might be the policy changes coming from the administration, the fact of the matter is that individuals will still be fleeing their homes for one reason or another until those longer term factors are addressed. And so I think deterrence is complicated because what we've seen from the family separation policy that was implemented a couple of years ago is that after the policy was stopped, the number of migrants crossing the U.S. Mexico border did not decrease significantly, and in fact, only a few months later was increasing. And at the same time, we've seen periods where the numbers decreased to near record low levels. And even this past year in 2019, where we had a small spike in the number of apprehensions in May of 2019, it was still well below the figures of the early 2000s, where there would be upwards of 1 million apprehensions across the U.S.-Mexico border in the span of 1 year. We didn't reach that figure in the last year. And what ends up happening is that deterrence, even if the hypothesis were true that it helps slow down migration, it would come at the cost of a lot of pain and suffering from migrant families, from individuals who are seeking protection. And what we can do is find a way to continue to meet our legal obligations without relying on policies that could be legally dubious and also enhance some of the pain and suffering that these families face. And if, as you very well know, Ali, a lot of the asylum seekers who are returned to northern Mexico to wait in some of the border towns in Mexico, they face a significant amount of violence, crime, extortion, sexual assault, and that has pushed parents to make very difficult decisions. The Department of Health and Human Services spoke recently about how they have seen upwards of 350 children who were sent by their parents to cross the U.S.-Mexico border by themselves after they were returned to wait in Mexico. And the reason they were sent by themselves was because the parents thought that journey, which is a very difficult and can be potentially a dangerous journey, was a better option than waiting in some of border towns where the remaining Mexico asylum seekers are waiting, where they face extortion, crime, they're attacked by the local drug syndicates. And so that is an unfortunately policy result that we're seeing and could potentially continue to see.
So then my last question for you is, what do you think the biggest misunderstanding is on the part of the American public when it comes to the situation on the border? And what do you think that the Americans understand the least or have misconceptions of?
I think the biggest misunderstanding is that we're not securing our border. Since the early 2000s, we have invested a significant amount of resources at the U.S.-Mexico border to good results. We have upwards of 650 miles of a border wall, and the president continues to build that border wall. We also have the highest number of Border Patrol agents that we've ever had at any time in U.S. history, about 20,000 of them. And all of this is in addition to more investment in technology at the border, which at the end of the day is a good investment because that is a force multiplier. If you can have technology that is able to see where individuals might be crossing and alert the Border Patrol agents, that makes the job easier and safer for Border Patrol agents.
Aaron Reichlin-Melnick is a policy counsel at the American Immigration Council, and Christian Penichet-Paul is a policy and advocacy manager here at the National Immigration Forum. You can find more information about Aaron, Christian, and the Migrant Protection Protocols at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And while you're there, take a second, subscribe to Only in America to catch all of the latest episodes. Be sure to tune in next week for our final chapter of Between a Wall and a Hard Place. We'll end the series with the Mexican ambassador to the U.S. telling us about the future of what the U.S. Mexico border could look like. Only in America is produced and edited by Emily Chow, Joanna Taylor, and Megan Wetmore. I'm Ali Nirani. Talk to you next week.